2020 was one hell of a year, quite literally. Without bemoaning the same tired, agonizing topics that brought us all down, let's talk about the saving grace of many during our dozen months shuttered indoors, gaming. Escapism is more in demand than ever before, with gaming being an excellent place to find it. A topic I made a criminally underrated video on you should totally watch. The industry is blasting into the mainstream faster than ever before. New consoles, impressive graphics cards, and a wide range of promising releases will carry this momentum into the future, but we have a strong backbone of excellent games in 2020 to send proper thanks. Today, I'll be doing just that, covering not only my choices for the best games of 2020, but some notable omissions and honorable mentions to make up a list that will include 20 games overall. And I want to thank Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Without further ado, let's kick things off with number 10. Number 10, Mortal Shell. This surprise AA hit stands true as my choice for the best pure Souls-like. While games like Hollow Knight, Nioh, Remnant from the Ashes, or even Sekiro share a handful of design elements that would appeal to Souls fans, those games hold their own distinct identities. Whereas games like Mortal Shell or Lords of the Fallen lean closer to an attempt to purely emulate the Dark Souls experience. I would argue the former spiritual Souls-like saw far greater success due to using FromSoft's playbook as more of a creative springboard rather than a strict Bible. They're all better games than Mortal Shell, largely thanks to their own unique ideas that evolve the formula. But if you're purely looking for something that plays the closest to Souls, Mortal Shell has you covered at a modest level. Difficulty in droves that rarely feels unfair, sprawling maps full of secrets and danger to test your mettle, weighty combat built around offensive and defensive gambits fueled by clever stamina management, a solid variety of enemies and bosses, rich lore to indirectly soak up through its world and NPCs, the list goes on. What helps Mortal Shell stand apart is the shell system. At the cost of expansive build variety, you inhabit the body of 4 distinct warriors. Each has a specific playstyle to optimize through upgrade paths, though all have the ability to harden, a mechanic that works as an oopsie button on demand, letting you brick through mistakes. Though it's essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card, it can be used creatively in combat to allow for calculated greed as much as a bailout. With this being the studio's first effort, the game has a fair bit of jank. The level design is too sprawling and lacks variety in foliage and architecture, making exploration dizzying. The healing system of farming mushrooms versus high-skill leeching parries punishes new players a bit too harshly, and the bosses outside of 1 or 2 standouts are a disappointment. So when I say it's the best pure Souls-like, understand there's still a lot of potential to be tapped in competition to its forefather. Even if it can't reach those heights, it's still an enjoyable experience that just made it onto the list at number 10. Number 9, Ghostrunner. Disclaimer that I was sponsored to do both a preview and review of the game this year. With that in mind, it's always a joy being contacted to cover a game that looks genuinely interesting and delivers. I was given complete freedom to be as critical as I wanted, and despite some hiccups, my praise for the game far outweighs my complaints. I'm a huge sucker for synthwave, so the soundtrack is an absolute bop. To its dark beats, the fast-paced platformer slasher gameplay really shines. Taking notes from games like Super Meat Boy, Hotline Miami, and Superhot, the game tosses you into a vicious playground to overcome. One hit spells death for both you and your enemies, but failure is met with a generous checkpoint and immediate respawn timer. As you're brutalized through the game's increasingly difficult enemy configurations, level layouts, and puzzles, you formulate strategies, gain new abilities, and speed toward a higher skill ceiling as you break through each encounter. Underneath the fast-paced action lies an intriguing narrative fit for the cyberpunk genre that further carries the momentum. There's a handful of unique boss fights that make seriously creative use of game mechanics to deliver a thoughtful battle in a game driven by one-hit KOs, and the game's constant evolution until the end keeps the format fresh. In the same vein as Hotline Miami and Super Meat Boy, the difficulty can be ball-busting to match the generous respawn timer. I would argue there are times where the difficulty feels overtuned, particularly due to a level of precision in platforming that makes maneuvers fall flat with the slightest error. There were even rare times where it glitched entirely, which could really sour a good run. At their worst, these high challenge moments are met with visually busy environments that were headache-inducing to the point I had to step away for a break. In the grand scheme, these moments are few and far between, and I enjoyed smacking my head against the difficulty to break through more often than not. If you love the idea of hacking and slashing your way through a cyberpunk world with synth tracks, tight platforming, execution demanding high skill, and a neat narrative to back it, then you'll love Ghostrunner. Just be prepared if you're someone quick to frustration upon defeat, as you'll surely suffer many in my 9th entry. Number 8, Ghost of Tsushima. Contrary to what a number of commenters on my 40-minute Ghost of Tsushima critique seem to believe, I enjoyed the game. The presentation is stellar. The combat, while overly simple, is still fun to execute. The story is bogus, but has a few moments where it shines, especially in the modest side stories. The world activities are fun for a time, even if they outstay their welcome by the end, and character progression is marvelously weaved into the open world. As with Ghostrunner and Mortal Shell, it's possible for me to see glaring flaws that don't jive with me and still have a good time. That was my experience in Tsushima. I enjoyed the journey despite my gripes and would recommend it to any fans of open world games. If you want my full take on the game, I encourage you to watch my big breakdown. Though it may not be worthy of high-end Game of the Year contention for me, I still think it's plenty worth a mention as a game worth your consideration. Number 7, Fall Guys Ultimate Knockout. As someone who grew tired of Battle Royale games before they even hit their mainstream stride, Fall Guys was a pleasant surprise that sucked me in for a considerable amount of time. Capturing the essence of what makes Mario Party minigames fun in a large scale that predominantly rewarded platforming prowess was perfect for me. I grew up on games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, Donkey Kong 64, Rayman, and so on. Platformers are my jam, and even though the genre may have fallen to the wayside in recent years, seeing it married to a popular format worked wonderfully. The game was silly fun. Whether you were claiming crowns by the dozen or smacking people off the path to victory, I had an absolute blast. Though I will admit that my enjoyment of the game was somewhat based in how good I was at it. By the time I stopped playing around the 50-hour mark, I was winning roughly 2 to 3 crowns per hour. I'm not sure I would have played for that long had I not seen such success, because the game's biggest weakness is its longevity. Some maps are a downright slog from the get-go and grow even more agonizing in veteran play. Even some of my favorite levels began to wear thin by the end of my time with the game. I imagine the game's quirks could grow grating much faster if you weren't claiming victory as often. Fall Guys is undoubtedly deserving of a spot on the best games of 2020, but it's awkward to say that despite my love in a vacuum here and now, I likely won't remember its existence in a few years. Even so, it was one hell of a flash in the pan for this year and was an absolute blast while it lasted. Number 6, Demon's Souls Remake. Take everything I've said I love about Demon's Souls over the years and slap a spectacular graphical overhaul on top of it. I've talked at length about both the original and the remake in their own videos, so I'll be brief. Demon's Souls, for better or worse, holds what feels like an auteurs rough draft for a killer format that flirts with masterpiece status before it's been shaped into greatness. Bosses are wildly hit or miss, but have never been more experimental. Level design is fantastic, yet brutal and full of underexplained mechanics like world tendency that are incredible when understood, but overly harsh on the uninitiated. Build variety is excellent, but fueled by a dozen broken builds, it leaves the game's difficulty in shambles for veterans. The lore is excellent, but maybe missing the depth that some expect from the later entries. As for the remake itself, the overhaul is phenomenal with excellent technical and quality of life changes, but missed the mark on recreating the artistic designs and soul of the original soundtrack. Looking at it in the bigger picture of the year, it's hard for a remake of a game I've played a dozen times to compete against the fresh meat for the best of the best. Still, it's a testament on how much I love this game that it finds its way just outside the top 5. You know what else I love? Knowledge. If you're a creative person looking to pick up new skills, expand your passions, and explore new horizons, today's sponsor Skillshare has you covered. With thousands of classes on a wide array of topics such as video editing, animation, illustration, creative writing, marketing, and even lifestyle skills, there's boundless opportunity to learn. It's no secret that some of you watching have dreams of creating your own content on YouTube. As a self-taught editor and scriptwriter, I wish I had access to so many valuable resources when I was getting started. Watching teachers like Oliver Astrologo edit circles around me after I've been doing this for 5 years, showing countless valuable tips on turning raw footage into cinematic marvels was inspiring. It's a reminder that no matter your level of success, there's always room to grow. As you strive to reach your creative goals in 2021, I encourage you to explore what Skillshare can offer you. For less than $10 a month annually, they offer a strong community that empowers you to accomplish meaningful growth. Oh, and the first 1,000 of you that use my link in the description get a free premium trial, so get on down there. Big thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video, and thank you for listening. Number 5, The Last of Us Part 2. With how divisive this game is amongst fans, I wouldn't be surprised to see a dozen comments telling me this is too low, followed by another dozen telling me that it's way too high. If you're familiar with my critique of the game's narrative, you might be surprised to see me even consider it worthy of a mention. Story is a massive part of what makes games great for me. Being connected to a game's world, its characters, and their experiences is a deciding factor in both immersion and what emotionally connects me to a game. My top 10 games of the decade was largely a love letter to games I feel bonded to on a deep level, thanks in big part to the connection I made to their writing. That tie is what ultimately had me place The Last of Us as my game of the 2010s. I cannot overemphasize how much of the opposite I felt for the sequel. I didn't find character motivations believable, it forced the narrative in a direction I didn't agree with based on what was presented, and there was a significant portion of the game I felt was unearned and frustrating to experience as a result. What I've been able to evaluate in hindsight after simmering over my immense disappointment for months is that I feel exactly the same as I did day one. The Last of Us Part 2 is a narrative disaster. Even so, I can appreciate the risks Naughty Dog took in telling their story as much as I think it fell on its face, because it clearly didn't for many critics and fans. There's a level of creative respect I have for sticking to your guns and how you choose to write something, as long as you aren't sticking your fingers in your ears and shouting la 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 through any constructive criticism. This respect is hardly enough to warrant the game even scratching the surface of the list, so why did I push it as high as number 5? Everything else about the game is marvelous. The survival gameplay is top-notch from start to finish with evolved mechanics from Part 1. Better tools in enemy AI, greater enemy diversity, wider maps and exploration, optional objectives, blockbuster set pieces, and greater environmental variety. The graphics, and particularly the motion capture, is breathtaking. The somber soundtrack fits the dark tale as well as the first. The accessibility options set a new standard for what every developer should strive for, and even though I think the narrative is a flop on the whole, there still are moments I enjoyed thoroughly. The thing is, I never needed a sequel to the original. The final gut punch in the brilliant ending was the lack of closure. I couldn't be too heavily disappointed because I saw this game as a bonus, and all things considered, it's quite a treat, especially if the narrative worked for you. It shows that Naughty Dog still has what it takes to make incredible games, and that's exactly what The Last of Us Part 2 is in many regards. It may not get my Game of the Year honors, but I can't disregard its achievements enough to place it outside the top 5. Number 4, Doom Eternal. As a follow-up to 2016's resurgent excellence, Doom Eternal knocked demon slaying out of the big fucking park. Gunplay polished to a brilliant shine, platforming elements in and out of combat adding welcome depth and speed, enemies emphasizing distinct weaknesses to encourage full use of an expanded and badass toolkit, levels designed as the perfect sandbox to test all these goodies, and a soundtrack that gets the blood pumping in all the right ways. Doom Eternal is everything 2016 did well in a faster, arcade-like package that hits almost every single note wonderfully for me. As for the sour notes, I personally wasn't as big of a fan of the bosses overall in the game compared to 2016. There was a lot of hullabaloo about the Marauder breaking the Doom dance rhythm, and I think that has a lot of merit to it. If you were a less skilled player and didn't look online to find the stun and double ballista technique, it was a serious record rip to the fun. Hindsight is 2020, and knowing how to effectively deal with him makes the moment-to-moment gameplay more fluid, which is appreciated. The only real fault I can knock Eternal for is its story. I know there are longtime lore buffs who appreciated how it tied to the other games, enjoy reading the lore logs, and also enjoyed the slightly greater emphasis on the Doomslayer's origins. For me, I evaluate stories on what is directly presented to me, and Eternal's story was confusing at best and boring at worst. If it worked for you, I'm glad, but for me it was a complete nuisance that I was really happy I could skip through. Overall, Eternal was competing between 2, 3, and 4 on my list, ultimately landing at number 4 simply due to the less enjoyable narrative, and my own personal genre preferences leaning away from enjoying shooters. With that in mind, it should speak to how worth your time Eternal is whether you love the genre or not. Number 3, Hades. Speaking of genres I love, my adoration for roguelikes has caught fire in the last few years. Hades takes all my appreciation for genre greats and packages it with an outstanding narrative. Games like Dead Cells have killer gameplay, music, progression, level design, and build variety, but lack solid writing to tie into those emotional bonds I love to make. Hades is rich with deep characters and a layered story that unravels naturally over the course of your many attempts at the perfect run and beyond. It doesn't just give a story to a roguelike, it makes the genre's core process the narrative's foundation. That idea alone is brilliant. What makes it so remarkable is the execution. Every voice actor nails their performance, bringing each character to life. They recorded an insane amount of dialogue, so much you'd be hard-pressed to hear the same lines twice in a game that can easily stretch into triple-digit hours. The slow burn reveals more about character motivations, builds relationships with the protagonist, and ramps up the gripping main conflict that has you more more eager than ever to start your next run. Runs that are amazing to execute thanks to nailing every other aspect of the genre, from deep combat to extensive build variety to a laundry list of upgrades and collectibles improving your chances, special events to keep runs fresh, and high difficulty modifiers that reward even better tools as you ramp it up more and more. Really, the only thing I can fault Hades for is how the levels it has begin to wear thin after a few dozen hours due to below average enemy and stage variety. Despite that, everything else fantastic about the game will keep you plenty hooked regardless. It's truly one of the most incredible games of 2020, one I can't recommend enough. Number 2, Nioh 2. Without a doubt, my surprise standout of 2020, Nioh 2 was leagues better than I ever could have anticipated. I went from a bad impression of its predecessor on release, to appreciating that game for what it was in spite of its flaws, to seeing Team Ninja masterfully improve them all while boosting everything the original did right with a sequel. The story, rooted in a fantasy version of ancient Japan, relies more on character development, proper arcs, and a self-contained story. The soundtrack ranges from solid at worst to some of my favorite tracks of the year at best. The graphical performance is more consistent, which is key for a precision action title. The combat, which was the original strength, is boosted astronomically by better balance in builds, new special moves to add depth, and significantly increased enemy variety. Levels make clever use of the self-contained maps to implement a wide range of design styles. The difficulty is fine-tuned alongside better balance to maintain high challenge without feeling unfair, but still rewarding big skill plays. And of the bosses I ranked this year, Nioh 2 has the most robust and high-quality roster of them all. It's genuinely one of my favorites in years. Many dismiss Nioh 2 as Nioh 1.5, and though the game may share structural similarities to its predecessor, I cannot overstate how massive a leap Nioh 2 felt in quality over an already solid prequel. It's a game I can see myself revisiting again soon with all the DLC, and encourage you to give a shot if you haven't already. Of course, it'd be difficult to play everything great in a year, a problem I'm not immune to. There are a few notable omissions from the list simply because I didn't play them. Animal Crossing: New Horizons. This wonderful getaway on the Switch was a vital vacation for reality for many Nook-oppressed islanders earlier this year. I loved the entries on GameCube and DS back in the day, so I'm sure I would have enjoyed this as well. Spring just happened to have many other games that caught my eye more, but for those of you who loved it, it's surely worthy of a mention. Ori and the Will of the Wisps. If there was an award for game I kept telling myself I'd play all year and never did, it's Ori 2. I thought the original was a solid Metroidvania with beautiful art and satisfying platforming, and I've heard nothing but high praise for the sequel, so I'm sure I'll enjoy it all the same when I get around to it. Persona 5 Royal. Oh, Royal, how badly I want to play you. Persona 5 was a top 10 game of the last decade for me, so there's little doubt this would be a Game of the Year contender. That said, I couldn't justify replaying the director's cut of such a long game so soon, even if I thought the standard edition was a masterpiece. It's hard to justify going on such a similar journey in a year full of new experiences I barely had enough time for. I will undoubtedly get a craving to dive back into the Phantom Thieves escapades, and when I do, Royal will surely be the way to go. Sadly, that hunger not hitting in 2020 excludes it from contention. Half-Life Alyx. I love Half-Life, but I don't care for VR. It's been in an awkward position of needing a killer app, but not having the install base to justify investing in that app. Valve finally took up the mantle of that catch-22 and delivered by many accounts what is a dark horse for Game of the Year. I can't personally comment since I didn't play it, but I at least want to recognize the achievement of making a game that appears to be less of a VR gimmick and more of a gateway into a new gaming platform. Cyberpunk 2077. I have no intention of playing this game anytime soon. I don't want to support CD Projekt Red as a company for reasons I shared in my video on the matter, but I also don't want to ignore the effects of the passionate developers on the ground floor. They were set up for failure by higher-ups and still delivered a game that many adore. Maybe I will give it a shot years down the line at a cheap price with all the promised fixes, but for now it stands as more of a dishonorable but notable mention that I'm glad some of you enjoyed. And Resident Evil 3 Remake. The only notable omission that I actually played was neck and neck with Mortal Shell for number 10. Ultimately, I decided to exclude RE3 Remake because it missed the mark on many aspects I loved about RE2 Remake. To keep it succinct, the horror and puzzle aspects felt notably absent in favor of a bog-standard third-person action game with a few cool set pieces centered around the nemesis. I still enjoyed the game, but it was a noticeable fall from the master-level grace that Resident Evil 2 Remake oozed. Before getting to number 1, there are 3 games that also made waves in 2020 for me or the industry, even if they weren't released this year. Among Us. A casual trend that became a full-blown craze, this simple space whodunit full of hijinks became an internet sensation thanks to online creators. It has casual appeal on mobile, more dedicated fun with friends and voice chat, and offers great entertainment with the right personalities driving investigations. The game's staying power wasn't great for me personally, but it was fun while it lasted. Dragon Ball FighterZ. A game I sunk far more hours into this year as it enters its 3rd season is the best Dragon Ball game I've ever played. I needed to wash the half-hearted efforts of Kakarot out of my mouth and finally decided to invest in getting good at fighters. The game's biggest weakness is lower accessibility, which is a mismatch for the casual anime market, but it's arguably the best attempt in recent memory at making a high skill ceiling fighter accessible to the masses. Combos that perform automatically for you at the press of a button, a super dash to gap close easily, and universal combo strings make the investment far less intense than most fighters to be able to play competently. And yet there's still plenty of high-end optimization for lab monsters to dig into. I really love how much of a match for the heart of the series that is. Training to be the best gives you, the player, the same intensity the Z fighters take into their battles. The huge roster is balanced unbelievably well, the team battles make for near endless configurations, even if a certain Ultra Instinct protagonist dominates the online scene, and there's constant updates and tournaments keeping the game's community alive. It may not be for everyone, but battling in fighters holds some of my most memorable gaming moments of 2020. And finally, Final Fantasy XIV. The only game that consumed me more than fighters, Final Fantasy XIV's enticing gameplay loop sucked me in for far more than I had prepared for. With an embarrassing amount of hours under my belt in mere months, I could go on for ages, but I'll keep it brief. The main narrative proves the MMO format can work without compromising a well-written tale. The gameplay has insane depth with over a dozen classes. There's an overwhelming content list from casual to high-end. There's plenty of optimization in getting good to reach that peak to keep people like me hooked into the endgame. The graphics are dated but hold up through beautiful artistic design. The soundtrack is easily top 10 of the decade in gaming. The multiplayer fosters friendships and interpersonal antics for better or worse. And the ever-growing nature of the game promises more of what you love as time rolls on. Investing so hard in an MMO is something I never thought I'd do, but Final Fantasy XIV was deserving of every second of my attention. And I may have never given it a shot had it not been for my game of the year, Final Fantasy VII Remake. An experience I can only describe as magical, this remake had an enchanting aura that glued me to the screen from start to finish. With 2 decades of gaming under my belt, it was surprising I'd never once played a Final Fantasy title. Of course, I'd always been curious about the series with its titanic legacy, but I always told myself I'll get to it someday. By that time, 13 was leading the series in a debatable direction, so I decided I'd hold off for a different release. When a remake of one of the industry GOATs was announced, I told myself that would be the one, my introduction to Final Fantasy. Booting up the game and watching the opening cinematic brought out emotions of vicarious nostalgia. It felt as if I was peeking into a once-in-a-lifetime event that would bring joy to so many lovers of the franchise and 7 in particular. The reality is, while Final Fantasy VII Remake may do a lot of things in spectacular fashion, some of those folks were disappointed. To discuss in detail would border on heavy spoilers, so suffice it to say, there were some narrative alterations that some people didn't agree with. As someone who had never played the original, I was able to take these changes at face value and personally found the direction they took extremely intriguing. The depth in which they go into each of the characters made me deeply invested in their storylines. This attachment was key to adding weight to Remake's marvelous real-time ATB combat. The devs managed to fuse the soul of the turn-based original with blistering action with commendable precision. Queuing commands for your party blend seamlessly into your own combos, dodges, parries, and abilities. The materia and weapon system tied to stat upgrades provides easy to interchange distinct builds with genuine strategic differences. The enemy and boss variety is immense, every member of the party is distinguished and provides valuable utility, and there are plenty of ways to test the limits of your skill through bonus challenges and a hard mode. The soundtrack is a banger with killer sound design to match, the graphical overhaul is gorgeous, the world it shapes exudes charm and is very eccentric. Really, everything about the game is nearly perfect. I will concede that while the added story depth enhances the early character development, there are a few spots where the game feels arbitrarily padded out. This becomes particularly painful when rerunning chapters from the beginning in hard mode, especially when you take into account the many hidden loading screens that force slow cinematic movement. Acknowledging its few shortcomings hardly diminishes the immense quality overall. It feels surprisingly complete for part 1 of what promises to be an epic saga, one I cannot wait to continue. Final Fantasy VII Remake isn't only my game of the year, it was a gateway into a franchise that I can see myself taking a deep dive into for the years to come. But of course, that's just my opinion. What were your favorite games of 2020? Let us know in the comments below. And of course, I want to thank you for watching today, much love to you, and I'll see you in the next video.